I've become known as the revolution guy because, and that's what I've gone on most of my podcasts to discuss, where I believe that the US will have a revolution or civil war within the next 6 months. And I stand by that. And I have a bet with my friend Andrew Heaton that we will have 1,000 politically motivated deaths by April. And I understand that sounds ridiculous, but I can explain why I believe that. And what I frequently tell people is that the world is not reasonable or rational. And expecting it to be reasonable is in fact profoundly unreasonable. And I've studied how people in the past predicted the future. And I consistently find the error that people overpredict for short periods of time and then underpredict for long periods of time. And the way history normally works is that you have an event and then it's just like thunder and hurricane. And people assume things will happen in a more gradualistic process than they often do, where you look at the end of colonialism, you look at the fall of the Soviet Union, you look at World War I, the 30 Years' War. And for a historic era to change, you need a tremendous amount of social tension, which builds up over time into a big event. And I've studied several different historic models for why I believe America will have a civil war or revolution. And when I say civil war or revolution, I like to say I'm betting against God. And what that means is that to predict the world, you have to understand every variable because everything is connected. And that's physically impossible. So I don't pretend to be correct all the time. And I, especially so for short periods of time, my predictive abilities crash. But I think America will have a violent conflict. And the four historic parallels I use the most often are the English Civil War, the French Revolution, the fall of the Roman Republic, and the American Civil War. And so I tease out parallels between them. And I could get more so into the reasoning for why I believe this, but I think it will happen as a side effect of the transfer of power involving this election. And if I'm wrong there, which I may be, my next guess is I think we'll still have a conflict like that, but it would be caused by probably a budget crisis. And I don't think we can get out of the next 4 years without a conflict like that.
Well, I famously have a cigar writing on roughly the time frame you've predicted, so I hope you're wrong because I don't want my country to burn down. But if you're right, I do get a cigar out of it, and that's really important. One thing that I have thought about a lot about, like the first thing that really shook me, and I had doubts previously, but what really shook me out of kind of my conservative talk radio bromides was what happened with COVID. Right. Like I kept hearing constantly when, tyranny comes, that's why we have the Second Amendment and people will rise up and they'll never allow this. There'll be a bright line in the sand that when they close the churches, I mean, obviously that will be the moment and, people will really fight back. And then just none of that happened. And so that was really my disillusion with the idea that there would be any real violence on the right. I mean, the left screams about January 6th and all that garbage, but, no one even showed up with a weapon, so the idea that that's a real insurrection of any kind is just a complete joke. But, I did think that the left still had violence in them because we saw what happened with the riots and we saw what happened, BLM and Antifa. These are still people who are regularly ready to go to battle. And so I assume that even though the right had kind of petered out on its revolutionary fervor, the left might take itself to a violent conclusion if it fed itself enough of its own rhetoric, these kind of things. That's kind of what I assumed going into this election. But it felt like at the end of this Trump victory, there really was just this complete exhaustion from the left. In that moment where, okay, Trump's winning, it's clear, here comes the violence, nothing, not even a protest. Even at a Madison Square Garden rally in the middle of New York where they're calling this guy a fascist who's going to end democracy. Just nobody cared and nobody bothered to show up. And so my question is, again, in my book, I thought it was more of a slow dissolution than a violent conflict. I think I'm even might double down on that at this point because it feels like even if things get worse materially for most people, you really would need a drastic crash. Like it can't just be a slow decline. Like we are talking, people cannot eat tomorrow type situation if we're going to see anything change.
So there's a couple of different points there. So give me a second to hit each one of them.
Sure.
So for the first side of it, I think this is going to happen sooner rather than later. And I think this is going to be a brief, something that happens pretty quickly because a handful of different variables. The first of which is that Peter Turchin is a data scientist who studies civilization, not civilizational, but state collapses. And so he's an author, and I'm pulling from a handful of other authors, like David Hackett Fisher is a great example, the Strauss-Howe cycle, etc. And they all point to there being a conflict in America in the 2020s. And you look at the previous conflicts in American history, such as the American Revolution, the U.S. Civil War, and the World Wars, is that there was tensions that built up until it snapped. And it was often unclear to figure out what would occur before the conflict until the conflict happened. Where in the American Revolution, the Brits kept pushing the Americans around, and then there was mutual instigating events until it culminated. Same thing with the U.S. Civil War. And I believe this will happen sooner rather than later because I'm looking at a variety of statistics. The one that scares me the most is debt, where the speed at which we are piling up such an enormous amount of debt is historically unparalleled. We can't keep going with this debt for another few years. And if you keep doing so, it's just going to completely destroy society. And if you look at the English Civil War, if you look at the French Revolution, if you look at the French Wars of Religion, they were all caused by budget crises, where one side refused to give another side a concession. So that's the first part of it. Second part of it is that the average American is careening very close to bankruptcy now. And as inflation hits, cost of living goes up. And so you're at this cross point where the government has to keep printing inflation, but at the same time, the cost of living goes up, which pushes people into poverty. And if the current trends continue, and I don't know why they'd stop, the average American is going to hit bankruptcy in the next year, as is the country's going to hit bankruptcy. And what a civil war or a revolution does is it provides plausible deniability for one faction to avoid an issue they're getting out. So if we have a revolution or civil war, both the Republicans and the Democrats have plausible deniability to have basically a debt jubilee, which is what they need to restart. And for my final point, the statistics Peter Turchin looks at are average income inequality, and competition for elite jobs. Those three statistics in 2010 he predicted would result in a civil war in America in the 2020s. And then if you look at other statistics where David Hackett Fisher studied inflation, and there have been even stuff like you can look at height, you can look at sleep time. When the average age of marriage gets above 28 historically, you're going to have a civil war. And so all of these wellness metrics are butting up against a cliff where you basically have to have a war in order to reset them.